The key thing to keep in mind for shipping, let me throw it into three general categories. Number one, 80% of the stuff that enables people to grow food is transported internationally, whether it's equipment or fertilizer or fuel. Only 20% of food is traded internationally, but 80% you need the inputs to grow it in the first place. Number two, roughly half of all oil is shipped on the ocean blue, typically by supertanker, along with everything that comes out of the Persian Gulf. And then number three, safety on the waves is what allows us to have the East Asian manufacturing model, which is a fancy way of saying the manufacturing model, because roughly half of all manufactured goods are produced in East Asia. And you will get components coming from Thailand versus Indonesia versus China versus Korea. But the key thing to remember is less than 1% of that shipping happens on land. Korea is in effect an island. Japan is an island. Most of the Southeast Asian countries are either islands or peninsulas, and they're ringed by mountains. So physical connections independent of maritime trade in Asia almost don't happen at all. And, the book is about how this happens on a decade's time scale, how the 2020s were always the decade that was always going to break down in. But events in just the last couple of months are speeding this up. A lot of this is probably going to be front-loaded. Well, think of what just happened in the first week of December. So the Europeans announced their plan for an oil export ban. A lot of the details are being made up as they go on. It's a very European policy in that regard. But what it is encouraging is a split in the way we view oil from the Russian space versus the rest of the world, and the different types of crude coming out of the Russian space. So the stuff the Europeans are primarily concerned about is Urals crude that is exported west to the European space. And that can only be sold for $60 or less now. And that's affecting insurance and shipping rates and the type of vessels that go in. And we saw over the course of the last 2 years how disruptions in simply the type of vessel being available can generate supply chain snarls. So now we're doing this with energy. But there's also a crude grade that exports to the Pacific that doesn't touch the European space at all, that trades differently. We now, just in the Russian space, have two fundamentally different markets, not just for pricing, but for physical accessibility, for the ability to get ships and insurance to allow it to move. One of the reasons why the world has been so stable, air quotes stable, since 1945 is there's been one oil price. Now, it's modified by the length of the journey or the quality of the crude, but there's one oil price and everything is safe. The Europeans have now created a system where a lot of countries in Europe are now going to have a vested interest in interfering with Russian exports west. That's one pricing margin. That's one security paradigm. That's one insurance policy system. But then in the East, where the Europeans are not players, it's a different crude grade at a different price point using different insurance systems by different countries. We have split the oil market now into at least three pieces, two Russian, one everything else, which means now countries no longer have a vested interest in making sure the oil flows everywhere all the time because we're not all like this together anymore. This is just the beginning. We're going to see this spread throughout not just the energy sphere, but pretty much every major commodity, and we're hiving the world up into different supply systems. And that is a recipe for 1910s and 1930s style conflict and competition. In the world before World War II, piracy, state piracy, and privateering were pretty common. Really? Because almost everything that was shipped had an obvious value. The cost of shipping before the Cold War and globalization was about an order of magnitude more than it was previous. And in the pre-industrial world, it was an order of magnitude more than that. In the pre-Deepwater era, it was an order of magnitude more. So interfering with shipping has always been very popular because you know that the value of the product is going to be high. It's only in the post-World War II era that the cost of shipping has dropped so much that we put everything on the way. So that's intermediate manufacturing, that's low value-added commodities, things that normally you would produce and consume locally. It used to be it was all pretty much luxury goods or something of very high value. Now it's a little bit of everything. We're kind of in this soft moment in history where everyone's holding their breath and wondering if the next time there's an incident, the U.S. is going to intervene or not, and I would argue we are not. Part of this is political. The Biden administration is the most populist administration we have ever had, more so than Trump. Basically, it feels like on trade policy, the Biden administration is going through Trump's tweets and picking them out one at a time and expanding them into position papers and putting them into policy and running a really good grammar scrubber over it. And we're basically getting the second Trump administration right now from a trade point of view. And then second, even if we wanted to intervene, this isn't the 60s or 70s. It used to be that there were no other naval powers. And so the United States with the destroyer-heavy Navy after World War II could patrol the global oceans because there wasn't a lot of competition and we had the right tools for the job. But since 1990, we've retooled our Navy, we've retired most of our smaller vessels, and we've concentrated naval power into our supercarrier battle groups. And if you want to knock off a country, that is the tool. But if you want to patrol the global oceans in an environment where other people have ships, you don't need the dozen supercarrier battle groups we have. You need like 800 destroyers. We only have 7. So even if we wanted to be the global policeman and patrol the waves, we no longer have the physical capacity to do it. Now, that sounds bad, and it is, but keep this in mind. The United States is the least maritime trade-dependent country in the world. Only 12% of our GDP is from trade. About half of that is NAFTA. We're not the ones who suffer if global trade breaks down. China's at the top of that list. Europe is a close second. China utterly lacks the naval capacity to project power more than about 1,000 miles from its coast, and it is completely dependent upon resource access and market access in countries that are half a level away. Now, the Chinese currently have 3 aircraft carriers floating. The first one used to be a casino. They will never claim that it is combat capable. They just bought it from Ukraine to refurbish it so they could learn how it worked. Their second one is a clone of the one that used to be the casino. The one that used to be the casino used to be a Russian carrier. They called it the Kuzanov, by the way, and the Soviets thought it was a disaster. So the Chinese do not claim that these two will ever be combat capable. They're training for their engineers more than anything else. And they do have a third one that they're going through sea trials right now. And it is a larger carrier that they actually designed themselves. But again, it's a prototype. They don't view it as anything other than a test bed. So they might get their first carrier in 2027. China technically is a larger country than the United States, but about 2/3 of its land is either too hot or too dry or too cold to be inhabitable. So 95% of the population lives on 1/3 of the land. Of that 95%, 70% lives in the North China Plain, which is an area that's not much bigger than the United States east of the Mississippi, maybe about 2/3 the size of that. So you're talking 1 billion people in one footprint. That footprint is flood-prone, drought-prone, and the river is actually, after 3,000 years of habitation, the river bed is above the surrounding land area, so it just flows down a dike. So if they get a heavy rain, the dike overflows and the river goes down into where people live. So when you hear about flooding in northern China, just run. There's no fix here. The land is relatively low productivity. In the south, you've got tropics and you've got mountains, so it's difficult to have integration. Hong Kong has always been a separatist area before it was called Hong Kong. And then you've got mountains and jungles separating it from Southeast Asia and India, but then you've got the great wide open of the Eurasian steppe connecting it to the Russian space. And off the coast, you don't have an ocean of moat. You've got all these secondary powers, Taiwan, Indonesia, the Philippines, Japan. And so China has never been able to penetrate out, but because they have a hard time unifying at home, others have often penetrated in. It's not the worst geography in the world. That's probably Afghanistan, but it's definitely in the bottom 10%. And it's only because the Americans unified the world into globalization that China exists as it does today, because we basically told all the countries that were preying on China to go home. Hell, we nuked Japan to underline that point. And so for the first time in Chinese history, the Han Chinese have been able to develop the way that they wanted to. And then Nixon and Mao had their summit and brought China into the globalized system to bring it away from the Russians. So I don't want to suggest that the Chinese played no role in their own success, but without the change in the strategic environment of Eisenhower and then ultimately Nixon, none of this would have ever happened. When the United States started industrializing and urbanizing, we started back in the early 1800s. And so we have had generations to adapt to a more urbanized environment. And so we have this middle step where we went from farms to small towns to big towns to cities, and the cities have suburbs. And so there's always been a degree of elbow room put into the American model, which lowers the opportunity cost of having children. China didn't start to urbanize until 1980, and then they did it all at once. So people in a single generation went from living on a subsistence farm to a high-rise condo. And so they went from having 7 kids to 1 kid in 1 generation. The one-child policy was on top of that. And now that it's been more than 40 years, they don't have a lot of people aged under 40. There's no one left to have the next generation. So this was always going to be the last generation for the People's Republic. It was always going to be a 2-generation experience total. But it's happened so fast that we don't even have an economic theory developed. Humankind does not have an economic theory for what would allow the Chinese economy to function in 2030. It's that far gone. In the United States, we are a large population, 330 million. In order to round out our younger age groups, we really need to bring in about 2 to 4 million immigrants a year. And we're well under that right now, and that is something that will come back to bite us again and again and again in the decades to come. But we're also a settler society. None of us are actually from here. And so the United States is capable politically of sustaining large volumes of immigration for an extended period of time. Just now is not one of those moments. Immigration can be part of our solution. There's a lot of complications in that conversation politically, but the United States is the largest economy in the world with the greatest upward mobility from people from the lower classes to the higher classes. And the attractiveness of that system, especially since it's mostly free, is robust. And you're right that when we do decide to have an open immigration system, we usually have no problem drawing in people. And that's before you consider what's about to happen to the wider world, where the delta between the US and everyone else is going to be huge. There's 3 reasons that won't work. Number 1 is scale. The United States has over 300 million people. The Chinese have about 1.3 billion. So to move the needle, you don't just need to bring in 3 times as many people. You need to bring in 10 times as many people under age 40. It's not clear that there are enough people that are potentially migrants to salvage just China, assuming no one else moves anywhere else. Number 2, the United States has developed an interesting reputation of late of being a little bit racist, with white people being a little sketchy. But in China, which is 90% Han Chinese, they are blindingly racist to anyone who is not Han. And to think that there are going to be incentives that will draw people, especially in numbers, to the PRC is ridiculous, even before you consider the disconnect in terms of economic activity. But third, there's the governing system. The US may be a flawed democracy, but a democracy it still is. China is a country where you are welded into your room when there's a health crisis. The casual dismissal of the very concept that private citizens have agency or interests is something that does not attract migrants. China has never had net inward migration. It's always been outward, people trying to get out, not people trying to get in. Now, there is migration within the Chinese system. People forget that China is not a traditional nation state. It is an empire.
Right.
And they have expanded out and conquered other groups. And you do get migrant from those poorer minorities into the urban centers. But again, you can only do that once, because then you've hollowed out the countryside. And that is what has happened writ large throughout the entire system at this point. Remember that there are 2 things you need for globalization to work. Number 1, you need the physical interconnectivity, the transport systems that are low cost and very, very safe. The more steps you can get in your supply chain, the greater capacity there is to expand into things that otherwise would be so low cost that you wouldn't trade them internationally. Things like wheat, for example, or plastics. Second, you need a balance of production and consumption. And that in many ways is a subset of demographic structures. So you need to have a significant number of people in your 40s, 50s, and early 60s in order to generate the capital and the skilled labor base to produce. But then you also need a lot of people in their 20s and 30s to do some of the lower skilled stuff as well as consume. And this all has to be in balance for it to work. The demographic aging we've seen in recent decades means that that second piece is just completely gone. And countries are increasingly finding it in their best interest to kind of hoard what consumption they do have and not allow trade access to it, and then producing more locally. We were moving this way before the Ukraine war, before the Chinese started to break down, and before the German industrial model started to implode. This has just sped everything up. As for the first and with transport, we're kind of in this hanging moment where we're waiting for someone to take the first shot, now that the Americans lack the capacity to protect the system. But even if we don't get a formal conflict over transport, by everyone kind of hoarding the production and consumption zones for themselves, we no longer have a vested interest anywhere in the world in what happens over the horizon. And as long as that is the case, we can get regional transport breakdowns that from our point of view don't affect us. But from everyone else's point of view, it's a bit of a disaster. And the more linked in your country is to these networks, the more vulnerable you are. So China, Korea, Germany, very much so at the very top of that list for different reasons. But they're all dependent upon the inflow and outflow. And so you can damage global transport significantly before the Americans really notice. Not only is the United States one of the world's biggest mining countries for raw materials, so is Canada, so is Mexico. Brazil isn't that far away, and it's all in the same hemisphere. So you can have an Eastern Hemispheric breakdown, which today, 3/4 of population, 3/4 of energy, 3/4 of food production, 3/4 of manufactured goods. And for the most part, the Western Hemisphere actually does better.